This week on the agenda, beyond Brexit. Has the new UK-EU deal healed all wounds or just papered over the cracks in a fractured world of global trade? Nine years after the Brexit vote, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen were all smiles this week as the two agreed a new trade deal, covering everything from fishing rights to the use of e-gates at airports. Starmer said the deal, following recent agreements with the US and India, put Britain back on the global trade map. But what does it really tell us about the state of UK-EU and indeed global trade at a time where some kind of certainty has never been more necessary? With me now are David Henig, Director of the UK Trade Policy Project, Pieter, Editor-in-Chief of BrusselsReport.EU, and Chris Southworth, Secretary-General of the International Chamber of Commerce UK. Gentlemen, thank you all for coming on the agenda. David, let me start with you, because we're 9 years on from that Brexit vote. What's your take on this deal between the UK and the EU?
I think this is a symbolically important moment in that it moves us on from the rancour, the arguments, the bitterness of much of the period after the Brexit referendum, and it moves us in towards a more cooperative and constructive partnership. That being said, it is more of an outline deal rather than going into details. Much remains to be negotiated, so that could yet break down that new spirit that is between the two parties. But I don't think that's the plan. I think what we're seeing from both the EU and the UK is a desire to move on from the past, to make the best of the relationship within the red lines that both parties are setting, and that's normal in trade relations, and simply to try to make this a normal, functioning trade relationship that works for businesses and other stakeholders in both the UK and the EU. And I think that this is a significant step in that direction, but much will have to be settled in detailed negotiations to follow.
Pieter, what do you think? Is this the end of the Brexit row between the UK and the EU? I wonder what this deal really says about the relationship from an EU perspective.
Well, it's certainly not the end of Brexit. You know, Brexit means perpetual negotiation. And indeed, sort of the trigger here was that the period during which European fisher companies were able to enjoy the degree of access in UK waters was coming to an end. So that was sort of forced, that was one of the factors forcing some kind of an update to the relationship. The British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, has, I would say, secured some good things, which is more generous access for agricultural products, or rather less bureaucracy at the border, which is positive. But in return, he has agreed to what is called dynamic alignment, which means that Britain is forced to automatically take over a number of regulations on agriculture, but also it's also aligning on certain aspects of energy policy. And on top of that, also the top European court will be able to have the final say over certain disputes. So I think in sovereignty, in terms of democratic self-determination, Starmer has actually made some important concessions.
Yeah. So it's significant. We're talking very much here of the symbolism of this deal. Chris, what difference is this really going to make in how British businesses are able to do business with Europe and vice versa?
I mean, to be absolutely straight, I mean, the world's moved on in a big way. You know, there are new threats, new challenges, you know, supply chains are being redrawn, trade relationships are being redrawn, and there are new power players in the global trading system stabilizing on the back of Liberation Day with the US changes in US policy. And the EU, Europe, is one of those. And I think this language talking more and more about Europe, not just EU, is quite interesting. It's a reflection of that wider community coming together and playing a global role alongside Asia in particular, the APEC and China, who are also stepping forward and that, you know, Europe and Asia are big supporters of the multilateral trading system, and that's good for business. So from that business point of view, this is good news on the back of weeks now of disruption, and there will be more disruption in relationship to the US. But don't forget those figures. The US trade is 13%, the rest of the world is 87%, and we're now starting to see 70% of that, including Europe, now starting to step in and say we need stable rules, we need more constructive relationships, we need to work together more in the face of those challenges. So I think, you know, overall, you know, it's a good step forward. There are some quite big areas where friction has been removed. You know, at a time when business confidence is really low, growth is flatlining at sub 1%. This is good news. This is a big trade relationship between the two countries, particularly for the UK. And those friction points are a real issue in terms of hampering trade between the two zones. So I think businesses will take away that as a positive, and you know, there's more to come.
David, would you chime in with that this is good news for business, but there are still maybe some friction points that to be ironed out? I mean, the UK's EU minister said this was good news for jobs, good news for bills, good news for borders, and we've heard it's putting Britain back on the world stage. Do you agree?
Well, I think I would distinguish between two aspects of good news here. And I think the first is very much following on from Chris, giving business the confidence that politicians are looking to remove barriers. I think that's tremendously important at a time when in the US we see Trump essentially undermining business, undermining investment, saying whatever you may invest, you can't rely on anything tomorrow. I think this is the UK and the EU saying, you know, please do rely on the fact that our trade relations are going to get better. That being said, I also think that UK politicians have been guilty of overselling what has been agreed in practice. There are some difficult negotiations ahead on exactly how those barriers will be removed, when they will be removed, exactly what regulations the UK will be forced to sign up to, whether these just cover the areas which are causing business tensions. Will there be broader requirements on the UK? So I think there are a number of discussions to come, so signifying the direction of travel, and particularly after the UK completed deals with India and with the US, it shows that this is a UK government that wants to make deals, that wants to try to make business easier. That's great, but you have to follow through on that. And as yet, we need to see more on that. And so I think there'll be some discussions ahead. So it could be a little while before we actually see those benefits.
You talk about the government talking it up, but not everybody's that thrilled about what's been agreed so far. I mean, Pieter, I wonder if you think that this deal locks the UK into the EU's regulatory framework indefinitely, as some critics have been saying.
Well, it's a fact that Britain has signed up to dynamic alignment. And, you know, recently, earlier this year, Switzerland, the Swiss government, also negotiated such an arrangement with the EU. But in Switzerland, this still needs to be ratified. And it's actually likely that we will have a referendum in Switzerland, or that we will see that in Switzerland, with the Swiss public potentially voting against automatically taking over the regulations of another jurisdiction over which their democratic representatives have no control. This is not a small thing. Moreover, there's a debate on whether this will actually constrain Britain in signing certain international trade deals. I think there is difficult to say, frankly, what the actual impact will be, but it is a fact that if the UK would, you know, copy certain restrictions on, for example, innovation when it comes to GMOs that you have in the EU, that, of course, then this will make it more complicated for Britain to you know, have an arrangement with America or other agricultural powerhouses. So that's a downside. Secondly, when it comes to energy, the fact that Britain is sort of shackling itself to the very controversial European climate policies that are driving up energy costs and are really harming at this very moment the chemical industry in Britain, in Germany and Belgium. I mean, that is a big thing.
Yes.
And the fact that you have less regulatory competition there is, I would say, a big thing.
I want to come back to focusing on trade, and something that you mentioned earlier, Chris, this notion of the world having moved on and having, excuse the pun, maybe bigger fish to fry, because Brexit effectively erected barriers to trade between the UK and the EU. Now we're in the midst of Trump's tariff crusade. To what extent do you think all of that adds impetus to the task at hand here?
Oh, absolutely, without any question of a doubt. These are not coincidences that we're seeing APAC ministers gather together with strong statements around global trade, removing barriers, modernising trade. You know, there's an awful lot of the UK-EU border should just be fully digitalised. A lot of those checks should not be happening in a modern data-driven trading system. You don't need to, because you already have the information. You know, but Asia is moving at a pace and really recognising that as an opportunity to increase trade. Nobody wants a trade war in that 87%. You've got to remember that. Yeah. It's bad news for the US economy and US consumers, of course, but for the rest of the world, I think this is a really positive sign that the big power players are standing up. And I think the role of the likes of the UK, we're not alone. Japan, South Korea, Canada, Australia are busy in the background doing deals with us, with the US and India in the last week, and others doing also deals and dialogues with the likes of China. You can see what's called the mid-tier economy starting to weave the system together, and that's stabilizing that 87% so that we can all enable trade to flow, because we all want growth, we all want more companies trading, and it's all important to our economy. So yeah. I think that is a good sign after all the disruption we've had over the recent weeks and months.
David, would you agree with that? I mean, do you think the global uncertainty caused by Trump's tariffs have made this deal more necessary?
Absolutely. We are seeing that countries want to come to deals. We are even seeing the EU showing more appetite than it has for a while for saying, actually, we can slightly water down what we need to see from trading partners in order to come to deals, which is really quite radical, I think, coming from Brussels, which has previously been pretty demanding in its trade deals with the UK. We've seen a pragmatism there to want to come to deals with India, with the US. And I think going back to Pieter's point, look, it's a fair point to ask about the UK being a rule taker and the implications on sovereignty, but equally the UK wants to be a trading powerhouse. We are a mid-sized economy. We aren't necessarily a rule setter. And in some respects, it may be better for the UK to just say, we will abide by other countries' rules because we want to trade. We'll leave people in the EU to have the conversations they are having, indeed, about whether certain regulations should be implemented or not. We in the UK want to abide by all of your regulations that we have to, so that we can trade. You know, if we can have a say, and there are some areas where we are strong players in setting regulations, financial services is an obvious case there, we'll continue to do so. But where generally we were already following other people's rules, we'll carry on doing that. And I think that for me, this is one of the welcome areas of update in the UK government's position, is to move away from the idea that around Brexit that the UK could be everything. We can have great trade deals, we can set all our own regulations, we can transform UK trade. We are the economy that we are. We want to be an open economy. We want to be a trading economy. I think that the current government has recognised that and is finding the best way in which that can happen. I think that does require a little bit more discussion and debate in the UK Parliament about the implications of that. But from my point of view, I think it's a perfectly sensible approach. Yes. Is almost to say, look, you know, we'll let the EU have their arguments about regulation. Let us know when you finish, and I'm sure it'll be broadly we'll be able to deal with it. If we're not, we better have a conversation about it. But otherwise, just let us trade.
Peter, what message do you think that this gives to the United States? Some commentators say that this is all about showing UK-EU unity in a less American world. What do you think?
Well, it's absolutely true that the European Commission, thanks to Trump, has become a lot more friendly to trade. One of the reasons why, certainly after Brexit, the EU has failed to agree a whole range of trade deals. For example, it failed to conclude one with Australia, is that it was constantly overloading these negotiations with demands to take over specific EU policy choices. It took a very long time to reach an agreement with the Latin American trading bloc Mercosur, and their politicians were saying, look, do you want to negotiate a trade deal, or do you want to send us a list with regulations and policies that we need to implement? So the EU is now toning down this, and that is positive. Now, of course, when it comes to whether Britain signs up to regulations of other jurisdictions or not, that is a British matter. But I think for EU competitiveness and innovation in the European Union, it's very welcome to have a bit of regulatory competition. For example, the British government has abandoned the idea to have very restrictive regulations on artificial intelligence. Keir Starmer wants to open up to innovation in that field, unlike the European Union, which has just introduced a very restrictive AI Act that is almost universally challenged by the AI innovative community. And as I mentioned, the same is true in climate and energy policy. The EU believes in taxation, punitive regulations on climate, all kinds of central planning and long-term schemes, even if that carries a high cost and ultimately doesn't really reduce a lot of CO2. So it would have been great if the UK eventually would abandon aligning with this failing model and would come up with something new. But because Keir Starmer has now decided to link the UK's approach to the EU approach in climate and energy, that's unlikely to happen anytime soon.
Chris, what will this relationship reset mean for the UK's relationship with China? I mean, isn't there a government audit of relations with Beijing due in coming weeks? I'm wondering what impact you see that having on British companies.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think a lot of this stuff about, who owns what is completely overblown. You've got the UK, 80% of global trade contracts on English law, 60% of global trade finances on English law, 80% of shipping documentation and the transactional activities are all in English law. So there's a give and take on all sides, and you have to just be pragmatic. The clue's in the title. This is dynamic dialogue, and for the UK, it's got to play a very careful line between working with China. We must work with China. We must work with everybody, actually, but certainly with China, certainly with the US, and particularly with Europe, which is our most important trading partner. And I think actually this deal and the deal we did with the US, or at least the bones of an agreement with the US, starts to sort of set some of that landscape out. But China, we need to be attentive to, as well as the rest of Asia. They're a huge player and becoming even more so in the new world that we're moving into post-Liberation Day.
We're talking a lot about the impact this trade deal is going to have around the world. But David, I'm wondering what this means for politics at home, because Brexit, the UK's relationship with Europe, is still very much a political hot potato in the UK, with the anti-European Reform Party way ahead in the polls, less than a year after Keir Starmer's Labour Party stormed to victory with a huge majority in the last election. Do you think this deal is going to move that dial?
It is quite interesting to look at UK politics and the question of Europe. So the Conservative Party leader, Kemi Badenoch, has opposed this EU deal quite vociferously, as have a number of the national newspapers. They've said that this is some kind of surrender. They're not, in fact, very popular, according to the opinion polls at the moment. And many people will remember that under their leadership was when we had the worst of the Brexit chaos. So a lot of people are saying about that, look, we just want to move on. What you're saying is just taking us back to an unpleasant period in the past that we don't want to be reminded about. Now, quite interestingly, Reform, led by Nigel Farage, who is a veteran Eurosceptic, as we would say here in the UK, has actually been slightly more restrained on this. Yes, he has opposed the deal, but in fact, when the matter was debated in Parliament, he wasn't there. I think that he knows that his political campaigning at the moment is dominated by the issue of immigration. It's no longer focused on the issue of the European Union, because Brexit has been more unpopular than popular, if I can put it that way. Vast majority of people think it was badly handled, and a majority of UK voters would like to see closer ties with the EU. Now, that doesn't mean that the UK will be rejoining, or even that a majority would automatically support rejoining, but they are in support generally of doing more on a more constructive basis with the EU. So the government's position is in line with voters, and I think that the Reform Party quite clever when it comes to thinking about public opinion. Yeah. I think they're well aware of that. They'll oppose the deal, but they will let the Conservative Party be the ones who take the hit for being particularly in opposition. Yeah. Really, I think people want to move on.
Pieter, what do you think that the EU makes of the political situation in the UK? And what might that say about the future relationship?
Well, the fact that you have the Conservatives announcing that they will repeal the deal, that's of course concerning for EU negotiators. Maybe we'll see a coalition between Reform and the Tories. I think it's very early days to make any prediction of that kind. I also think that even if we would see such a coalition, we will see a lot of British pragmatism. Indeed, the immigration challenge is much higher on the political agenda at the moment than all kinds of Brexit related issues like this in the United Kingdom at the moment. And of course, Brussels, what they're trying to do is to, get a deal and make the best out of this. As I mentioned, the fishery lobby was, of course, strongly pushing for this, and they sort of have achieved what they wanted, but that's all a very tiny percentage of the European economy. Also importantly is that we have some kind of a military and defense part of this new arrangement, but I would also say that's less important than the more multilateral deals that we see popping up between European governments now. In Western Europe, rearming and rebuilding the defense that has been neglected for decades is now a very big priority, and alone, therefore, I think that European governments will always show a lot of pragmatism towards any British demands, given how important the UK is as a military power.
Chris, at the end of the day, do you think that this deal has really hit the reset button on Brexit? Or is this a balanced detail that allows the UK to be distinct, apart from the EU, although still very much at the centre of European trade?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge that certainly on the UK side, but I think also to some degree on the European side as well, going into this and the whole issue with Brexit is just to leave the baggage behind. The world has moved on. It's also moved on at national level as well. There are a lot of common themes here that European countries, or continental countries, I should say, are dealing with exactly the same as the UK. Falling living standards, rising costs of living, the need for growth, flatlining economies. That's what's kind of driving some of the sentiment. If you look at the polling, it's quite interesting, actually. It's been a radical shift on the UK side. Only 6% strongly oppose a closer relationship with the EU. That's a dramatic difference to where it was, and 41% strongly oppose divergence. So, the mood has changed, but the lobby that is anti-immigration and sort of anti-sentiment of the EU is very noisy. But if you actually look at the data of what people are actually saying, it's move on. So I think this is a big step forward. It's not everything. There's a lot more to play for. We could be doing a lot more, but this is a great step in the right direction. And that Defence and Security Pact in the core of it is a big driver pulling us together for very pragmatic reasons. So I think it's pragmatic on all sides, good, good for business, good for consumers. There's some good consumer stuff in there with e-gate access. That makes a big difference in terms of removing friction for ordinary people. And hopefully we'll see things on things like youth mobility, which again, that's just friction for no real reason, really, frankly, in the bigger scheme of things. And let's focus on the big picture, the real threats to the global trading system, conflicts, and those issues that are really impacting our economies and not enabling us to drive up living standards in the long term. That's what everybody wants to see.
Pieter, where do you see the relationship between the UK and the EU developing from here? I mean, are we going to see more deals like this, but to cover other areas beyond the use of e-gates or pets being allowed to travel freely?
Well, there's clearly an attempt to have some kind of easier migration. It's not going to be free movement, but some kind of a generous visa scheme with all kinds of safeguards, specifically for young people that is currently being negotiated. And I think, if you're looking for some big changes, then I think that's definitely the one thing to keep an eye on.
David, let me ask you the same question. What do you think? Are you expecting more deals of this ilk soon that dig a little bit deeper into those pressure points?
I hope so. I think that it's very much in the EU and the UK's interest to make these deals, to develop a closer relationship. I just hope that the vision is in place on both sides that actually points in that direction. I think that in the UK, we've been a little bit tentative and nervous about talking about what we really want out of the EU, particularly in public. But I think also the EU has been a little bit nervous about taking relationships beyond simple free trade agreements and turning them into more of genuine partnerships. I think there is a little bit, as Pieter was suggesting earlier, there's a little bit of a desire to over-regulate for the whole rest of the world on their own without that kind of consultation. I think the EU would be much better off for having those kinds of strategic partnerships, including with the UK, and I think the UK will be better off for going further. So I hope that path can be found. Yeah. I think it's early days. I'm not declaring that's going to happen now, but I hope that's the path we can find, and I think that will be for the good of businesses, citizens across Europe.
David Hennig, Pieter Cleppe, Chris Southworth, thank you very much. You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda. Towards a green future, how China and the EU should work together to help save the planet. But for now, from me, Juliet, Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.